We are now going to talk about rhythm and blues before 1945. So again, music of the African American community performed by urban African American musicians targeted to urban African American audiences. Now, rhythm and blues is a marketing term. It's not a genre of music. It's just to track the music of African Americans, but it's problematic in that there are so many different subgenres of what we now call rhythm and blues music. But back then, especially within the African American community, but just in general, all these subgenres didn't have labels. They were just music. Labeling music is very much a European um, tendency, a European practice. So it was many white audiences, excuse me, many white scholars would go back and assign these names to these subgenres, but they wouldn't have been used at the time. If we were to go back to 1930s, we wouldn't have differentiated within about these different styles the way we're going to in this lecture. But I will give you these terms because I think they are helpful in understanding this music if it's a genre that perhaps you haven't yet been introduced to. One of the first things I said at the beginning of this lecture is that at this time period, we have three genres of music: mainstream pop, country and western, and rhythm and blues. However, they are not equal. Mainstream pop dominates radio. It's almost all mainstream pop. Again, there's also classical, but we're not really focusing on classical because we're tracking the genres that lead into rock and roll. So let's just kind of take classical off the table, but remember that classical was also popular. So mainstream pop is the primary type of music that's on the radio. A little bit of country and western and a little bit of rhythm and blues, but they were certainly not on the same level. Well, what happens is music executives, a lot of them, I guess this is sort of good, sort of bad. They don't care about race. They don't care about skin color. It's good in that it's not at all racist. They care about making money, so maybe it's not good. But the point is, the fact that there's no African American music on the radio at this time, or at least very limited, it's not an act of preventing African Americans from being successful in the music business. It's just that they don't think it will sell. They think Frank Sinatra will sell. They think Glenn Miller or Bing Crosby will sell. So that's why they're the people on the radio. Same thing with country and western. They're not getting radio play either, even though they're also white. We should also say that these charts, mainstream pop, country and western, and rhythm and blues, were not for the fans, they were for the merchants. So we have this magazine called Billboard. Billboard is still used to chart success in music sales. So Billboard was for people who had a radio show or a record store or had a restaurant with a jukebox. You would subscribe to Billboard magazine to see what the most successful songs were, so you knew what songs you should stock in your jukebox, in your record store, or on your what songs you should play on your radio station. So that's where these terms come from. I just think that's an important primer to have as we jump into rhythm and blues. So blues itself is the most important aspect of rhythm and blues, or at least the earliest one that we'll talk about. So the first composer we need to talk about is an African American by the name of W.C. Handy, who actually sold a lot of sheet music before World War I. Songs like Memphis Blues and St. Louis Blues. And again, at this time period, the music of Memphis, Tennessee was very different than the music of St. Louis. Well, the first blues records, actual recordings, actually come from the 1920s, and the most important is a woman by the name of Bessie Smith. And she really was an important figure in the development of the blues before World War II. So she's an important figure. Make sure you take note of her. One of her first big hits was called Downhearted Blues from 1923. And when you think about these small recording studios that didn't have state-of-the-art equipment, it might be easy to just assume that they're going to, not sound the best, but they were actually very professional, very sophisticated recordings for their time, and you would never think it wasn't coming out of one of these big studios in an important big city. Well, what happened is Bessie Smith was so popular that just like when Frank Sinatra was successful, all the other record labels had to go out and find their own kind of version of Frank Sinatra. Bessie Smith's records were so successful, she actually sold more than 1 million records to both African American and white audiences. Again, this is another example of crossover, that record labels and record producers are going out into the country and these heavily African American areas, and they're trying to find other performers who are going to be able to sell records for them. Well, one of the men that is discovered is named Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson is a guitar player and singer from the Delta Blues, the Delta region of Mississippi. And sadly, he's a member of, it's kind of a dark term, but it's called Club 27. It's a group of famous musicians who died at the age of 27. A lot of these causes of deaths are drug overdoses, things like that. But Robert Johnson's cause of death was actually homicide. He was murdered, specifically poisoned by another man, and it had nothing to do with his music career, but it was about a woman. Um, we're not exactly sure what happened, but basically it's something along the lines of Robert Johnson said something to her, put moves on a woman, and her boyfriend or husband or something found out and got upset, and he poisoned Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson is famous as a virtuosic blues guitar player and singer, and supposedly, as he tells the story, he got these virtuosic abilities by selling his soul to the devil. And the song from 1936 called Crossroads Blues retells this story of what exactly happened and how he met the devil and how he sold his soul and everything. In addition to becoming an amazing guitar player as a result of supposedly selling his soul to the devil, he also got these incredible loud vocals, which would allow him, a lot of these Delta performances were in bars or on plantations, and he could sing so loud his voice would carry. Again, it's like Bing Crosby, but before the microphone, Bing Crosby was able to sing quietly with the microphone. Before that, you had to have these loud, booming vocals, and Robert Johnson did. He would often play with a knife or a bottle. A lot of Delta musicians did because the problem was down in the rural South, it's not easy to get guitar strings. You don't just go to Guitar Center or order them on Amazon. It's very difficult. So what they would do is they would use guitar strings forever until they broke, and they would get rusty. And of course, there are issues and risks of getting tetanus, things like that. So what they would do is rather than put their fingers on these rusty strings, they would drag a knife or a glass bottle along the strings, and they would play, and that's how they were able to get these sounds. And not only does this prevent them from perhaps injuring their hands or breaking a string, but this is actually an extension of these African musical traditions that I talked about earlier, bending notes. So we have call and response, bending notes, blue notes, which are these pitches that aren't in a regular Western scale, and these syncopated complex rhythms, specifically from Western Africa, countries like Ghana. So the bottle or the knife allows him to slide between the notes rather than playing these really precise notes like you would hear in European instruments, in European music. Robert Johnson is somewhat popular in his area where he's living in the 1930s, but really he becomes this huge important figure in the 1960s because a guitar player and singer by the name of Eric Clapton, who's in this English band called Cream, start covering his music, specifically that Crossroads Blues, as well as a group of the part of the hippie movement of these white kids in San Francisco rediscover his music. So that's when he becomes popular. But during his lifetime, even one town over, a lot of people never heard of him. So back to this theory about Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil. I think it's worth pointing out a theory that emerged just in the last few years. Robert Johnson plays significantly faster than a lot of his contemporaries, right? He also uses these really funny tunings. Like, for example, he'll play a song tuned to like B flat standard or A flat standard. And if you are not a musician and that doesn't make sense to you, that's perfectly fine. There will be many times in this semester where I will reference specific musical terms just so that the people who are musicians can maybe have one more layer of complexity to their understanding. However, if that doesn't make sense to you, these tuning of these other musical terms, nothing like that will ever be on a test. So please don't be worried. But anyway, so he uses these uncommon tunings, right? And it's kind of weird, but people don't think too much about it. Maybe he just didn't have access to a tuner or something like that. However, what someone did with Robert Johnson's music is they slowed the record down, because if you slow a record down, not only is it slower, but the pitch drops. He slowed the record down until the pitch was in something normal like E or maybe G. All of a sudden, when you slow the record until it gets to a normal pitch, his playing is at the exact same speed of all the other guitar players at the time. So this person's theory is that Robert Johnson was just a normal guitar player of normal ability for the time period, but what happened is his record producer sped the record up intentionally to make him sound like he's playing really fast, which also resulted in weird tunings. So I have no idea. No one does for sure. It's something that would be impossible to tell at this point, but I'll present you with both theories and you can do further research if you're interested. There's another genre that emerges at this time. Again, this we're talking about before World War II, before 1945, or I guess before the conclusion of World War II. So this would be called jump blues, which specifically does come from the war years. So 1941 to 1945 is when marks America's involvement. So this comes from big band jazz, but it has fewer horns because big band groups were very expensive to take on the road. One of the most important figures in jump blues is called Louis Jordan and his Timpani Five. Songs like Caledonia from 1945 and Choo Choo Boogie from 1946. And these songs have crossover success on the R&B and pop charts. So what about rhythm and blues after World War II? So let's talk about post-1945. Well, again, I mentioned this before a little bit, but the blues is a product of African American musical elements that come from these slavery work songs, slavery era work songs that were passed down through the generations, combined with European instruments. Well, we have this event after World War II called the Great Migration, where all of a sudden, with booming industry in the North, African Americans start migrating to northern cities, Baltimore, New York, Detroit, Chicago. Many of these cities still have segregated neighborhoods with African American communities and white communities. But because that starts happening, they're bringing these blues traditions to the North. And we start to see these indie labels pop up. So indie is a shortened term for independent label. It just means it's a small operation. It's not a big, multi-million-dollar corporation with these huge budgets. It's very small, just some guys working out of a small office, maybe working out of their car, something like that. So these regional cities have more and more record labels popping up that want to record African American music, specifically rhythm and blues. We also have regional radio because, again, many of the audiences move to television. So now these radio stations have openings, and African Americans can get their music on the radio to a far higher degree than they ever could have before. Radio also presents an interesting advertising opportunity. So one important concept to think about is that radio is a for-profit industry. They're trying to make money through radio, through selling advertisements. So what they would do is, unfortunately, again, it's the 1940s. There are plenty of cities, Jim Crow laws are still in place, where some companies won't let African Americans in the building. They won't let them in restaurants. They make them sit in a certain area. They make them use different restrooms or different drinking fountains, if they let them in at all, right? So a lot of African Americans wanted places where they knew their business would be welcome, where they wouldn't be treated horribly, right? So what happens is these companies, which cater to African American communities, start buying radio play that advertise their businesses, and they want to make sure African Americans are hearing it, so they start having these stations that play African American music. So rhythm and blues music gets played with advertisements that specifically cater to African American listeners, and then that starts to build this African American radio industry. One of the most important indie labels is actually out of Chicago by these two brothers, Phil Chess and Leonard Chess, started in 1947. This is called Chess Records. So Chess Records is associated with this genre called Chicago Electric Blues. Just like Bing Crosby was able to change the game by having a microphone and sing quietly, the same thing happens now. Blues performers don't need to be able to sing loud either. They can just sing in the microphone. But the role of the guitar really changes because before the guitar was so quiet, you could barely hear it playing with a big orchestra. It's one of those things where if the guitar drops out, you kind of can hear something's different, but you can't put your finger on exactly what's missing. But now with the electric guitar and the amplification and different, 8-track recorders, things like that, we're at the point where the guitar can actually be featured as a primary instrument, even when playing with a band. So we have this Chicago Electric Blues, electric guitar, electric bass, drums, and a vocalist who you can hear over all these loud electric instruments. So that's what Chess Records specializes in. And some of their most important artists were Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Howlin' Wolf, and in the early part of his career, Chuck Berry. Chess Records also featured a genre or a subgenre called doo-wop that we'll talk about in just a moment, but they were known for Chicago Electric Blues. So for Chess Records, they have 3 people. They have Phil, Leonard, and a secretary. And they have regular office work. They have a day job. They have regular office work by the day, but then at 5 p.m., they push all the furniture aside and they start recording music just there in their regular office building. As they become more successful, they get better facilities, but there's this raw quality to the music that is achieved through not having the best equipment available, and a lot of the people that love this music love that rawness to the sound, so they actually prefer some of the early stuff. Ironically, the way this works is they would record the music in their studio. they would studio, just their office. They would take it, have it pressed on albums, and then they would literally put all these albums, all these vinyl, like 12-inch albums, in the back of their truck or the back of their car, and they would drive around to record stores and try to sell the albums. And what would happen is they would just move them very slowly in this capacity. However, the problem is they had to pay for all this up front. They had to get the recording equipment, they had to pay the people to press the albums, and then they would give them at first for free to the record label, to the record stores, and the record stores would sell them for more than they had to pay for them, but they wouldn't pay Chess Records, or any indie label for that matter, until the records had been sold. So for a long time, your money's tied up, and it could take a few weeks, it could take a few months for you to recoup those financial investments. So it was a difficult job leading an indie label because you had to pay upfront for everything. And it kept the indie labels small. And in fact, there was actually even a penalty for growing too fast, although it was difficult to grow too fast anyway. Another indie label, this one out of New York, is called Atlantic Records. It's led by two Turkish men named Ahmet Ertegun and Herb Abramson. And they had arrangements for their tunes, which is a little bit different. They would actually do the own arrangements, so they would have, write out exactly what all the horns would play, things like that. They had professional musicians they would hire, and really they were imitating the big pop labels. They were saying, what are these big labels doing? Let's just do that, but on a smaller scale. And they were very successful with that model. They have a sound engineer, who's another one of these people that we're going to come to over and over again because he's very important. But his name is Tom Dowd, and he's the sound engineer for Atlantic. And if you remember from earlier, I said Les Paul got the first Octopus, that 8-track recorder. Tom Dowd got the second. Now, there is a very useful, very important, in terms of music history, clip that I'm going to show you in a moment that will kind of show Tom Dowd with Jamie Foxx portraying Ray Charles, that really shows how this 8-track recorder worked. So, check this out.
Hold, wait, cut. Now, y'all know that sounds off. You know what, the 3-part harmony is off. Let's start it all over again, from the top with the band. I believe it. Whoa, partner, what was that?
I knew you'd like that, Ray. It's an 8-track. We just got it. We can record each part separately.
Whoa, Nelly, I can't wait to see that. What is so funny?
Nothing, partner.
Marge is drunk. Jeff, you go home and sleep it off.
Marge, come on now, let me take you home.
No, I'll leave when I'm good and goddamn ready to.
She's good and goddamn ready right now.
Why don't you make me leave then, sucker? Teach you to treat me like some piece of meat. No, I ain't shutting up, Pat.
Should we get in there? No.
Get them all
He gonna
out
have
of
to
here
make
right
me leave
now.
if he want me to go.
You know what? You ain't got to shut up. I'll tell you what, Jeff, get all of them out of here. Every one of them.
You a cold-ass bastard. No, let go of me, Jeff. You a cold-ass bastard, Ray. See, he wouldn't even spit on me if my ass was on fire.
Come on, damn right I wouldn't.
Put me down, Jeff. Put me down, damn it.
You dropped your shoe.
All right, come on, let's get back to work. All right, Tom, this is what I want you to do. We're gonna lay my vocals down and finish the harmony parts.
How are we gonna do the harmonies, Ray? You sent the girls home.
I know what I did with the girls. Let me take care of that. You just turn that 8-track on, and I'll do the girls' parts myself. And go out here somewhere and find me an old Johnny girl.
1 minute. The hell's an old Johnny girl?
I think I got an idea.
Last night you were dreaming and I heard you say,
Oh, Johnny.
when you know my name is Ray, that's why I believe that now.
I believe, yes, I believe.
I say I believe that now.
I believe, yes.
Other figures from Atlantic were Ruth Brown and Ray Charles, who you just watched a clip of. His early music was from Atlantic, songs like I Got a Woman from 1954. Also, we have Big Joe Turner, who's going to be a very important artist we're going to talk about at the end of this lecture, and the Drifters, who go on with hits like At the Boardwalk in the 1960s. The final indie label that we'll talk about today is called Sun Records. So Sun Records is Sun Records was founded by a man by the name of Sam Phillips in 1953, And his day job was to create these mobile recordings. So he would just go around and record people that wanted a record, like a church choir or something. But then in the evening, he would record African-American artists on the side. So he was white, but he was recording African-American artists. He had this passion for rhythm and blues music. And he actually records what scholars today call the first ever rock and roll record. It's called Rocket 88, recorded in 1955. And Jackie Brunson and his Delta Cats were the band. And actually, the man playing piano is named Ike Turner, famous later for Ike and Tina Turner. So this was recorded by Sam Phillips at Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee, but then it was leased and released by Chess Records. So Sam Phillips recorded it, but Chess Records were the ones that distributed it because even though they were small, they were much bigger than Sun and they had greater distribution than he did. Well, because of the success of this, he's able to get some, to hire some other acts like Rufus Thomas, Elvis Presley in 1954, who's going to be one of the most important figures we're going to talk about in this entire class, Elvis Presley, of course. Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, and Roy Orbison. We're going to get into that a little bit more next time, but that's sort of your brief introduction. There are some other record labels that we'll talk about, though, so you don't have to necessarily worry about writing these down, but I just want to give you an idea of what was going on. We have Specialty Records by Art Group in Los Angeles, founded in 1945 with artists like Little Richard. We have Imperial Records, founded by Lou Chudd in Los Angeles, 1947, artists like Fats Domino. So he released the music. He didn't record it, but he released it, just like Chess did with Rocket 88. And Dot Records, founded by Randy Wood in Tennessee in 1951 with artists like Pat Boone. So those are some of the indie labels. Let's talk about some of the major labels. We have Decca, which is actually in the United Kingdom, 1937. Acts like Bill Haley and Buddy Holly. Mercury in Chicago, 1946, with the Crew Cuts and Patti Page. We have RCA Victor in New York in 1901 with Perry Como, Sam Cooke, and Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley starts with some, but he's eventually going to move to RCA. Columbia, founded in, believe it or not, 1885 in New York with Johnny Ray, Doris Day, Johnny Mathis, and Gene Autry. MGM in Los Angeles, 1946, with Hank Williams and Conway Twitty. And lastly, Capitol Records in Los Angeles, founded in 1942, later becoming EMI in 1956, with artists like Nat King Cole and Gene Vincent. These major labels were different than the indie labels, specifically in that, as I mentioned earlier, they could get records into national distribution basically immediately. If they sign an artist, they can get their music in record stores within a few days, whereas an indie label, it's almost impossible to think that they could do that. Like they're lucky if they can get it into record stores in their city in a few days, let alone these major labels that can do that across the entire country. The major labels left the indie labels alone. They were no threat. They're not really taking up that much of the market share, so they just kind of let them do their thing until rock and roll hits and indie hits start selling big numbers, and that's going to be where we're going to talk about in the next lecture. But at this point in what's going on, they're sort of leaving each other alone. So let's talk about the rise of regional R&B radio in the 1950s, and this is our final section. There are 2 subsections to this, and that is the conclusion of this lecture. So let's get through this part. So again, I mentioned this before, but radio is a for-profit enterprise. Music publishers are selling sheet music, and they're selling records, but the records are in support of the sheet music. That slowly starts to change around this time where the records become more and more popular, but that's the model that we have up to this point. I also mentioned that advertisers are paying for audience exposure. That's how radio stations make their money. As I mentioned, Black people will often turn away from businesses, and if a company advertises on an R&B station, they know that their business is welcome there. And there was this hole in the market as many of these stations were moving to TV. So all important concepts to remember. So let's talk about some important radio stations with their DJs. So again, this is not something you have to write down. This is just to give you context of what's going on. We have WDIA in Memphis with their DJs Rufus Thomas and B.B. King. Yes, the B.B. King we all know was originally a DJ. WHBQ in Memphis with DJ Dewey Phillips, who was the first person to play Elvis's That's All Right Mama. So there were these radio programs across the country, many in Memphis, Nashville, Atlanta, Los Angeles, that all featured exclusively Black musicians and Black music. One of the most important radio stations, though, was called WJW in Cleveland with a DJ by the name of Alan Freed, and he had this show called The Moondog Show, which started in 1951. And Alan Freed was one of these DJs where audiences thought he was African American by the sound of his voice, again, dialect, speech pattern, things like that, and many were really surprised when they found out that Alan Freed was white. I mentioned that WJW was in Cleveland, and that's why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is going to be the final topic that we discuss in the Unit 7 video, is based in Cleveland because Alan Freed is there, and kind of rock and roll as its own genre, unique from mainstream pop, country, and western rhythm and blues, in a sense, gets its start in Cleveland. However, what happens is Freed does move to a station called WINS in New York. However, in New York, the name Moondog was taken. Again, his show is called The Moondog Show, so he brands his show The Rock and Roll Party. And rock and roll within the African American community is a euphemism for having sex. This is the first time the term rock and roll, though, is associated with this musical style, the blending of country music, rhythm and blues, and mainstream pop. Now, it hasn't quite blended yet. At this point, it's still rhythm and blues, and that's going to emerge into rock and roll, but we'll get there in the next lecture. One thing that's important to keep in mind is none of this would have been possible if not for mainstream entertainment moving from radio to television. There are so many radio programs that are now available for African American musical stylings that is a result of that shift. So what happens is Alan Freed is playing his music both in Cleveland and in New York, and what happens is he's assuming that African American teenagers are going to be listening to this music, but white teenagers are also chiming in, and they have portable radios in their cars, things like that. You have a portable handheld radio or a radio built into your car, of course, and a lot of white parents during this time period probably wouldn't have been okay with their children listening to rhythm and blues, but when they're in the car or when they're at school, their parents can't hear what they're listening to, so they're listening into this music, and they can't go into these black neighborhoods and they can't go into these clubs. So this is their opportunity to get a glimpse of what life is like in African American communities. Well, Alan Freed eventually puts on this show expecting an all-black audience, but as I mentioned, a bunch of white kids show up. And that's really the first time that Alan Freed understands that just like what happened with jazz and big band, where it's an African American musical style, but white people are interested, the same thing is happening with this music. Rhythm and blues is an African American musical style, but white people, white teenagers specifically, are very interested in. And this sets the stage for rock and roll being the music of America's youth, as well as tearing down various racial barriers. Some of the other African American styles that were popular at the time were doo-wop and gospel. So let's start with doo-wop. Doo-wop is primarily an a cappella vocal style. A cappella just means singing with only voices, no instruments. Develops after World War II, and it's sung by black men in urban areas. And there were these social clubs that would battle for reputation and territory, where basically you would create your own vocal arrangements of songs and you would go sing these songs, and there'd be an audience and they would cheer or applaud, and that would determine who the winner was. And you would build territory, things like that, like this vocal group is the best in this neighborhood or community, things like that. Well, many of these groups had a lot of tunes, but the one signature tune, like their knockout tune. Like they really wanted to beat another group in a vocal battle, they would sing that knockout tune. And what happened is producers would recruit these groups from the streets. So they would actually just walk the streets in these African American communities in Baltimore, New York, Chicago, Detroit, areas like this, and they would listen until they heard these really great doo-wop groups. They would say, hey, let's record that. So they would invite them in the recording studio, and they would record the song. They would bring in a band. So initially it was a cappella on the streets, but when it's actually on the record, they have a band playing with them, and they got a lot of hit records. But they were one-hit wonders because, again, these individual doo-wop groups took a very long time to create these tracks, to create these arrangements of songs, and they couldn't just overnight come up with a new one. It takes a very long time. So that's why so much of the music from this time period, of this doo-wop style, that I'll give you some examples from in a minute, you only have just a few, like one or two songs from each group. Doo-wop is known for its nonsense syllables, so things like shidoopi-doo-wah doesn't mean anything, but it sounds really cool when you put it together. One of the primary theories for where this comes from is that Louis Armstrong, famous jazz trumpeter from New Orleans, showed up to a gig and lost his trumpet or dropped or broke, or for whatever reason he got up on stage and didn't have his trumpet, so he just sang the parts that he would have played on the trumpet with these doo-wop syllables instead, and that's also the invention of scat singing. So some examples, we have a song called Shaboom by the Chords from 1954, and these songs were big hits with black and white audiences, but they didn't think black renditions of these songs would be successful on white radio. So for most of these songs, we would have a white band do the same arrangement. And while it sounds similar, a lot of the feeling is often missing. So what I want you to do is listen to the original Chords version of Shaboom, and then listen to the Crew Cuts, which is a white band. You can tell just from the name, the Crew Cuts is a very popular white hairstyle at the time. Doing Shaboom the same year, they sound very different, even though they were recorded back to back and it's the same song. We also have a group called, an African-American group called the Five Satins, with a famous song In the Still of the Night from 1956. And one of my favorites, a band called Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Frankie Lyman was actually, I think, 13 years old when this was recorded. A few hits from them, but the one on your playlist is called Why Do Fools Fall in Love, which was a #1 song in 1956. Many of these songs are often slow dances. You can also think of a song like Earth Angel featured in Back to the Future. So we also have gospel, though, as being the other genre within the two of these. So we have gospel, which comes out of the African American church. Gospel harmony and gospel musical stylings really influenced almost all music in rhythm and blues to some extent, and in some subgenres more than others, but these gospel elements are present in all African American popular music styles from this period of the first half of the 20th century. It's using African musical elements just like so many other subgenres are, such as call and response, bending notes, blue notes, syncopated rhythms, all of that. It's also known, though, for its melodic embellishment. So rather than just singing a few notes, adding in extra ornamental notes to just make a line more interesting, which you can hear on many of these examples. There was a conflict, though, for a lot of these groups that were using gospel influences in their music, because the idea was that gospel music is God's music, but rhythm and blues was the devil's music, because a lot of the themes were sometimes sexual. So many musicians actually gave up playing. So for example, we have Ray Charles' song, I Got a Woman from 1954, which was a gospel tune originally that Ray Charles reconfigured into a love song, also songs like Hallelujah, I Love Her So. And the counter argument for this approach is that all music is God's music, not just gospel, and that all that is not sin is sacred. So that's the justification, which I think is perfectly fair for why this music continued and was so popular. Other songs by Ray Charles that were very important later on were songs like Georgia on My Mind. However, we also have a woman named Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and she actually has a song called This Train, where she's just doing a straight up gospel song, but she's playing electric guitar, specifically a Les Paul. Very cool arrangements. There's a video this week of Sister Rosetta Tharpe performing the gospel song This Train. Okay, final stretch, last topic. This is something called the Hokum Blues, specifically known for its sexual elements. So basically, the Hokum Blues was a style of music that was considered to be dangerous to middle-class white sensibilities in the 1950s. It would use double entendres, double meanings, metaphors, euphemisms, so they would sing about things that were seemingly harmless, but the joke is that it's actually about something sexual. One example of this would be Alberta Hunter's song, My Handyman. And these songs were accused of having a lack of class, a lack of sophistication, but really they weren't limited to the Black community. Jimmie Rodgers, one of the earliest star of country music, had a song called Pistol Packin' Papa from 1930s, and you can listen to that song and figure out when he says he's packing a pistol, what his pistol is, what he's referring to. I'm sure you'll figure it out. So really, even though this music was criticized, it's playful, it's humorous, and it's intended for adult audiences. It's like going to see a comedy show. You wouldn't invite your kids to this comedy show. It's for adults. It's supposed to be for adults. And you could argue that the people releasing this music weren't trying to sell it to teenagers, that it was the teenagers who were seeking out the music. So this is an argument we hear again in the 90s and the 2000s about rap. This was just a clever way to play with sexual ideas without actually saying the thing outright in any kind of raw or vulgar way. However, there was a strong negative reaction because white parents often fail to realize that these songs were never intended for children to hear. These negative reactions are also perpetuated by this unfortunate stereotype this white myth that black men were only concerned with like deflowering young virgin white girls, a racial stereotype that gained momentum after the silent film Birth of a Nation. So again, these songs often reinforce these negative racist stereotypes, and a lot of the time they had obvious titles, so no one really should have been surprised by what was going on. So I'm going to give you the title of some of these Hokum Blues songs. Let Me Play With Your Poodle, 60-Minute Man, Work With Me Annie, which was followed up with Annie Had a Baby, and they were all like that, where it's so clearly a play on words, right? So when the Hokum Blues songs would do well on R&B charts, and white record producers wanted to capitalize on the success, but they knew that the songs as they existed wouldn't sell to white audiences, what they would do is they would change or obscure the lyrics so that you couldn't hear those sexual elements. And often they would replace the word, anything having to do with sex with having to do with dancing. It'd be an interesting, Freudian discussion to have about that. But the songs became clean, inoffensive, and accessible to everyone. However, there were rare occasions where even the record labels wouldn't get the sexual references, and sometimes they actually made their way onto the white version of the songs. So for example, Big Joe Turner, who we talked about a little bit ago, had this song Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and it's covered by the white group Bill Haley and the Comets. Well, one of the lyrics in that song is a one-eyed cat peeping at a seafood store. Well, that is a reference to male and female genitalia. However, they didn't catch it because, again, it's subtle to play on words and sometimes it slips through the cracks. Well, that concludes our first lecture and the primer of musical events and stylings within mainstream white pop, country and western, and rhythm and blues leading up to the 1950s. In the next lecture, we're going to get into the birth of rock and roll.